Hi, and thank you for joining me for another lecture. And friends, today we're on Haftarat Vayeishev, which is in Amos Perek Bet Pasuk Vav till Perek Gimel Pasuk Het, or Amos chapter 2 verse 6 till chapter 3 verse 8. It reads, referring to the northern kingdom, כה אמר אדוני על שלושה פשעי ישראל ועל ארבעה לא אשיבנו על מכרם בכסף צדיק ואביון בעבור נעלים. So said Hashem, for 3 rebellious sins of Israel, but should I not exact retribution for the 4th, for their having sold a righteous man for silver, and a destitute one for the sake of a pair of shoes? Okay, Pasuk Zayin. השואפים על עפר הארץ בראש דלים ודרך ענבים יטו ואיש ואביו ילכו אל חנרה למען חלל את שם קדשי. Those who yearn that the dust of the earth be upon the head of the poor, who twist the way of the humble, a man and his father come to the same maiden, therefore profaned my holy name. Pasuk Chet. ועל בגדים חבולים יטו אצל כל מזבח ויין anushim yishtu beit Elohechem. They recline on garments held as security, right next to every altar, and they drink wine brought up with fines in the temple of their gods. Now, so far the Almighty is speaking about the despicable acts performed by Israel towards others. The word translated as sin here is pesha, but biblically there are actually a few more words used for the idea we call sin, the others being avon, chet, and over or avera. And these, although not clearly categorized in Tanakh, like the majority of other biblical words, they acquire their meaning by the context that they're used in. Avon meaning iniquity, pesha meaning to trespass, chata or chet meaning a mistake or missing of the mark, and over or avera meaning transgression or to go over something, which is actually a word that stems from the word ivri, Hebrew, on how it states that Avram Avinu was called an ivri because he physically crossed over the river. And you must know that even sins are broken down by categories, lest anyone would claim that all sins are the same. As a matter of fact, sins, or loosely averot, are just a subcategory of negative mitzvot, while negative mitzvot are a subcategory of mitzvot in general. Categories and subcategories, my friends. This is big boy religion, not preconceived notions or first stage thinking here. And yet another category of averot, or sins, at least from a practitioner level, is the notion of intent, the basis on whether the sin is done on purpose or by mistake. If it was done bemazed or beshogeg, which is how the Torah determines what sacrifice needed to be brought. For example, a blood sacrifice was never brought for an intentional sin, with that sole exception of swearing falsely. Let someone say that without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sins. Well, not according to this Torah, my friends. And friends, one thing that many naysayers and judgmental individuals, both in the Orthodox and Christian world, have in common is their unfamiliarity with the internal dynamics of a mitzvah. And how in terms of breaking a mitzvah, how it's easier to condemn and regulate than to try to understand and possibly give a little breathing room to the everyday Torah keeper. On how being better safe than sorry is not always better, or how sometimes it's just a gateway to OCD religion, or on how the other extreme is also a trap. On how there is actually a silly group in the religious Jewish world that has standardized sin to such an extent that they have begun to teach that sin and even repentance, as it's viewed today, are Christian inventions. That in Judaism, all you have are laws, similar to a secular society's set of laws. And when you sin, all you do is violate that law. That's it. Nothing to feel convicted about. An idea that, although from a micro perspective is true, as an overview of the legal process, friends, on a deeper scale, it misses the ethical dismemberment that occurs on a macro scale, which is so eloquently being expressed in this haftarah here, which is the slow ethical dismemberment within a society that is the result of sin. In other words, we fail to ask the question, not just what is biblically accurate, but mainly what works. Works how? In other words, what actually attempts to fulfill the reasons you chose to become religious in the first place, which I hope was solely to leave this world better than you found it. Actually, I would say that many have asked the question, what has kept Christians on the upper echelon of those who produce the most good in a society when the average Christian does not proclaim to keep Torah? Easy, friends. It is their overall hatred for sin that has made them so socially, ethically productive. In other words, for hating the result of breaking mitzvot, i.e. sin, this has forced them to avoid breaking the mitzvot that cause evil, a type of sin, to occur in the first place. Because you must know that not all sin is evil. And really, just like not all mitzvot are technically good. Because, at least from the outset, some mitzvot are just amoral. In other words, neither good nor bad. But they all, even though some may not either initially get you to produce good or evil, they all act as a bridge to one of the two. In other words, one has to already have, from the outset, a functioning moral compass if they're ever going to properly represent the emunah, our religion, and not attempt to acquire this after becoming religious. And it's this form of thinking that has made people either lawyers or strict clergymen. Right? The lawyer assumes that because something is legal, it must be ethical. And the clergyman assuming that because something is prohibited, it must be evil. We even see this in society, that most would not confuse running a red light equivalent to armed robbery. And this, friends, to quote Thomas Sowell, is the trap of first stage thinking. And I think that this portion of the lecture should be called the ultimate understanding or the dynamics of a mitzvah. Because honestly, friends, I know there is a trend nowadays to say that all mitzvot, all commandments are of equal value. But the fact is that, at least according to Torah itself, this is not the case. Not even in the slightest way. And it's really this ethical analysis of what a Jew must do in this world that has most religious Jews not doing much, at least from an ethical, social perspective. And friends, I think this reiterates something I said before in a previous lecture, that every ceremonial act, whether it's the keeping of Shabbat or donning tefillin or even the separating of shatnez, the separating between wool and linen, again, every ceremonial command, they're just there to guard and help us magnify the ethical ones. Because yes, there is at least a slight distinction made between the two in Torah. And in case someone tells you that there are no classes of mitzvot, tell them, or remind them of Hukim, Mishpatim, Edot, Mitzvot Ben Adam Lechavero, and Mitzvot Ben Adam Lemakom, or Mitzvot Aseh, and Mitzvot Lo Taseh, Mitzvot Deoraita, Mitzvot Derabanan, Gezerot, Takanot, Minchagim. Now, yes, many of these classes mean the same thing. I'm just bringing them all down so you know that not all mitzvot or commands are to be understood as belonging to the same ethical class, group, or had the same level of importance attributed to them. Which is why the statement uttered by Christians that someone died to free us from our sin or from the law never really meant much to the average Jew, because the first question that we would have asked is, for what kind of mitzvah did he die for? What did he free us from? For example, is it okay to murder now, or are we just allowed to wear wool and linen? Now, out of respect to my Messianic listeners, I know this is not how they view their Bible, but this is just a generalization of non-Messianic Christians as a whole. And friends, you must also know that it is really just a midrash, a legend that teaches that there are only 613 mitzvot. Not a harmful midrash, but I always try to be very clear in my lectures so we don't embrace ideas without first knowing their source. To the point that many rabbis disagree on the actual mitzvot that appear in the numeration of 613, as well as many disagree on how the actual mitzvot are to be kept in one's daily life. I mean, just look at the list of all those who enumerated them or commented on a numeration. The Rasag, the Rambam, the Ramban, Nachmanides, the Smag, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Chavetz Haim. Actually, in the Gemara, there are two reasons for the number 613. As one brought down in Makot that there are 365 negative mitzvot, which coincide with the 365 days of the solar calendar, and 248 mitzvot, which coincide with the number of limbs or sinews in a person's body. Actually, another hint the Talmud tells us for how they came up with 613 is because the gematria, the numerical equivalent of the word Torah, is 611, plus the two commandments that the Torah in one place states was uttered by the Almighty to the Jewish people. This equals 613. Actually, there are other places in Torah where it states that he uttered all the 10 statements to the Jewish people. So this belief of only the two is not really set in stone, like most things you may have heard from the rabbis. Not to mention that, in my and Torah's opinion, the way we can gauge not just the class, but the importance or the value of a mitzvah is by the punishment that's attached to it. In other words, most of the time, with how stringent the onesh or the punishment is, we can then determine how grievous the averah or sin was. Okay? So, regarding mitzvot, I'm just going to break down all of these categories of mitzvot to give you, the listener, a hands up on the whole gig. And friends, although the Torah only lists, like we said, mishpatim, hukim, and edot, I really think the other categories help us stay a little neater when clearly trying to discuss Torah and halacha and hashkafa, Jewish outlook, with others. First, like we said, mishpatim, hukim, and edot are technically the only categories that appear in Scripture. Well, to start off with the least popular but easiest to recognize, edot. Edot are literally witnesses, or also known as testimonies. In other words, commands that commemorate and testify an event, like Shabbat or Hagim. Now, there are many different opinions on what edot actually encompass. In other words, it's not literally etched in stone. When, however, the Ten Commandments, the Aseret HaDibrot, not the literal commands, but the actual luchot, the tablets of the 10 statements, also fall under edot. Actually, they're often called the luchot ha'edut. So for all intents and purposes, edot are biblical historical monuments meant to be used as reminders and theological placeholders for Israel, so that when Israel does go astray, they could then recreate their theological heritage from these edot. And friends, I would say that edot are technically the closest the Torah comes to classifying a mitzvah. And even this category is not always so clear. For example, mishpatim, literally judgments, the next category, are not clearly defined as what Agadah has made them to be. In other words, Chazal bring down that mishpatim are mitzvot that make sense, commandments we can figure out, while hukim, literally decrees, are commandments we don't know the meaning for. And some Meforshim even teach that we will never know the meaning for. And honestly, acknowledging the fact that this only stems from Midrashim and Agadot and does not need to be taken seriously, the real question is, how did it creep into the Jewish vernacular to begin with? Look, I'm for classifying mitzvot for the sake of order also, more than the next guy, but when you attempt to define a category such as hukim as mitzvot that are not understandable, that we do not know the reason for, and like I said, that some teach that you will never know the reason for, you begin to develop a generation that is going to fail to attempt to teach this Torah from a rational, practical perspective. And many, because hukim and mishpatim were never clearly enumerated by Chazal, possibly even the majority of the Torah's mitzvot, they begin opening the door for the Jewish world to later on begin taking on practices that make no sense. Now, it is true that we have certain hukim, like the paraduma, that according to the Agadot, that even Shlomo HaMelech didn't know the reason why, teaching us that we shouldn't even bother trying to figure out because he knew it all, right? Well, to start off, it's only a myth that Shlomo HaMelech knew everything, because the text only states that he was gifted with a special wisdom to judge. Wisdom, chokhmah, not dat, not knowledge, stating that this doesn't really mean that he knew everything, like the Agadot state, that he would speak to the plants and to the reptiles. All this built off of nonsensical Agadot, which then states that he didn't know the reason for the paraduma, the red heifer. So that's the reason that we could never figure it out, or even try to. And worse, they don't just limit it to the red heifer, but they go as far as to include all hukim. And by the simple fact that Shlomo ended up going off the derech and letting his pagan wives convince him to worship idols, tells us that he really wasn't the wisest man who ever lived. But regardless, friends, this is one of the main Agadot quoted to prove that we should not waste our time trying to understand this category of commandments in the Torah. My gosh, friends, I tell you, Agadot have done more harm in Torah life than virtually any other notion out there. But there were many rabbis who did not buy this nonsense of not being able to understand the meaning of hukim, like the Rambam, whose Mor Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, was written to deal with the Tameh HaMitzvot, the reasons behind the commandments, hukim included. Now, I don't believe that if you don't understand a mitzvah, you shouldn't keep that mitzvah, but rather, on the merit of the mitzvot that you do understand, you should keep it. But to make a statement that you will never understand them, and which is why you should just exercise blind support, not just for the Torah, but even for the rabbis who claim that they are the only ones with the keys of discernment. My friends, this is what is nonsense. And friends, one thing we shouldn't forget to ask is, what does the Torah say about hukim? Does it have anything to say? Or does it actually tell us that we don't know and will never know their purpose? Friends, what if I told you that the Torah gives us a tremendous hint? What hint? Don't forget, my friends, Davar in Perek Daled Pasuk Vav, when it says, Ushmartem v'yasitem kichi hakmatchem uvinatchem le'enei hamim. Observe, therefore, and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples. Asher yishme'un et kol hachukim ha'ele. Did you hear it, friends? Hukim, these hukim, that when they hear all these hukim, ve'amru rak am chacham ben avon, hagoy hagadol hazeh, that they'll say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. So here, my friends, the Torah is telling us that by us keeping hukim, what we were taught we couldn't know the reason for, we would actually look wise among the nations. So the nations are either very stupid or easily impressed, or someone's wrong here. And I can tell you right now, it's not the Torah. And the more mysterious we make the Torah, the more charlatans come out of the woodwork claiming that only they can explain things. And this is how cults are born. But anyways, the next category is what's known as mitzvot ben adam lechavero, commands between man and his fellow man, and mitzvot ben adam lemakom, commands between man and God. Now, these are pretty much self-explanatory, right? Caring for the widow would be a command between man and man, and keeping Shavuot would be a command between man and God. And yes, these two categories, at least in title only, are rabbinic. Although by the 10 commandments, or literally the 10 statements, we see that these are evenly set up by this standard we just mentioned, right? The first half representing God's relationship with humanity, and the second half representing man's relationship to his fellow man. Now, the fifth commandment of Kivud Avayim, of honoring one's parents, could be the tiebreaker, but many have actually explained this mitzvah as one directed more towards obeying the Almighty than actually one dealing with his fellow man, because as it states that the Almighty himself will reward the one who keeps it with long life. Now, we then have rabbinic mitzvot. Now, for a mitzvah to have the status as a rabbinic mitzvah, they would have to have been developed by the court, also known as a Sanhedrin. Again, a court that derived its authority from Torah itself, Parashat Shoftim, and many other parashiot. And this will bring us to the world of halachot. And in case some are wondering, why didn't I mention what's known as halachot le Moshe Sinai, commandments that supposedly were given directly to Moses and not developed by the court? It's because this idea of what is a halacha le Moshe Sinai is really agarata in itself. In other words, by someone classifying something halacha le Moshe Sinai, or just classifying it a ruling derived by the Sanhedrin, it wouldn't make it any less or more obligatory to keep. In other words, halacha is halacha, whether it was developed by the Sanhedrin itself, or whether the Sanhedrin accepted it and validated it as something that came from Mount Sinai. Regardless, it still passed through the Sanhedrin, and the reason we keep it is because of the command of lo tasur, of not straying from the authority, from the rulings, from the practical rulings of the Sanhedrin. In other words, they have the authority to tell us what to do, but they don't have the authority to tell us what to believe or where something is derived from. It's up to you. If you want to believe it, fine. If you don't, fine as well. But my friends, what you don't have is an excuse not to keep these laws, especially when the Torah in Parashat Shoftim and many other parshiot commanded us of the mitzvah of lo tasur, of not straying from the rulings of the court, the Sanhedrin, what we call chazal. So, how do halachot differ from mitzvot? Or do they really? In other words, friends, halachot are the final stage of a mitzvah. So if grapes are mitzvot, the wine we drink are the halachot. In other words, halachot are the final practical interpretation of the mitzvot, the literal commandments found in the Torah. Now, some teach that there are only 7 rabbinic mitzvot, but honestly, I have not found any evidence that these supposed 7 mitzvot differ from any other of the rabbinically instituted mitzvot in halakha. Actually, the reason they claim that there are 7 specific mitzvot is because there are 7 mitzvot developed by Chazal that we say, Asher Kedeshanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu, that Hashem has sanctified us with His commandments and commanded us to do X or Y mitzvah, that Chazal actually invented. But how would that separate those mitzvot from all the other mitzvot that Chazal developed? Now, an idiotic notion floating around in the Jewish world is that the notion that the oral law or the rabbinic law along with the written law existed before the Torah. The same written Torah was given on Mount Sinai. So, What do I think about this? Well, by the simple fact that this notion is not mentioned in Torah, this should really give us the answer we're looking for. Yes, my friends, it's nonsense. And what's even more nonsensical is when rabbis will go out of their way to state this is even provable in Torah. For example, they will ignorantly show that when it states that Avram Avinu kept Torot, or like it says, Ve'toratai, that this means that Avram Avinu kept two Torahs, i.e., both the written and the oral. When anyone familiar with Hebrew knows that Torot in this pasuk just refers to instructions. In other words, Torah in plural. Because yes, the word Torah means instructions. And yes, the Almighty gave not just Abraham, but also Noach and many others instructions before the actual Torah was given on Mount Sinai. And friends, only because you choose to disregard many midrashim as disposable does not in any way mean that you don't accept the oral law. Because again, midrashim and agadot are not oral law. Halachic rulings are oral law. Now, we do have a notion of a midrash halacha, but in that case, only the halachic value is taken and not the message contained in the Agadah or midrash. And no, only because we call rabbinic laws oral does not mean they were given on Mount Sinai along with the written law. This is, again, also only in Agadah. Actually, the reason they're called oral is because they were transmitted orally from court to court down the generations. And it's funny how people get stuck on this phrase of Torah Sheba'al Peh. I mean, how about the other words we use to describe our oral tradition, like the Divrei Sofrim, or actually the original term, or the oldest term, to describe these laws by Chazal, known as Mitzvat Zekenim, or the laws of our elders, which is a lot harder to corrupt than the term oral law. Now, within these mitzvot, you have gezerot, which are rulings or laws created to act as a fence around the Torah to keep you from violating specific Torah commands. And then you have takanot, that were edicts developed by the court that are not related to mitzvot in the Torah, like Purim and Hanukkah. And then you have minchagim, literally customs. However, not like the word is used today, which could include any custom in general. But in terms of halakha, these customs were customs that actually begun among the Jewish people, and then the court instituted them as law. So in short, no Sanhedrin, no new customs. Sorry, folks, who try to create new binding customs among the Jewish people and try to pass it off as halakha, like Lag BaOmer, Upshirim, Mourner's Kaddish, mourning during the 3 weeks, or the Sphira, Kol Nidre, Shlugan Kaporis, and on and on. But yes, friends, hopefully now, when you look at a mitzvah, whether from the Torah or a rabbinic mitzvah or halakha, you are able to see a bigger, clearer picture. And friends, I think I'll just end here for this Haftarah. Please join us next week for the next Haftarah. And friends, for more information on everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.org. Thank you.